Welcome to the Virtual Sports Medicine Conference and Episode 9, Early Specialization in Youth Sports. My name is Stan Conte, and I'll be the moderator for this episode. I want to start by talking about the CEUs before I get to the presenters. As you probably have discovered, this is our first evidence-based CEU webinar. We've been working on this for quite a while. We finally got it approved. So all ATCs will get 2.0 EBP CEUs. Remember, you have to fill out the post-webinar survey to receive the CEUs from the BOC. That's a requirement. You're going to hear us say that about 5 times in this presentation. I want to especially thank Carolyn May for helping us applying and receiving approval for the evidence-based practice CEUs. Many of you may know Carolyn from her years of work and her continued work at ASMI baseball meeting that has been presented by ASMI for over 30 years. Unfortunately, we had some difficulty with the NSCA. We're not able to give out credits for CSCS individuals on this episode. We apologize for that. We tried to get them done, but we're unsuccessful with communicating with them, I guess, properly. We'll continue to try to obtain those in the future, however, we think they're important. PTs can get a certificate of completion with contact hours. You'll get a certificate because of the varying regulations in each state. PTs need to submit their certificate to their particular state for credit. As we've done in the past, we're going to do several polls during and after the presentations. The first one we're going to put on in a few minutes. Nancy Flynn is going to put that on. You'll see it down below on your screen, asking the group 4 general questions on the topic of early specialization. Go ahead and answer those everywhere you want to. We'll give you the results of the poll between the second and third presentations. At the conclusion of the webinar, there will be a BOC survey that we talked about before. You'll get that at the end that you can do at the very end of the presentations. It also will send you an email 24 hours afterwards where you can do it again. At the very end, we'll put up a slide that shows you what the link is. So we have 3 or 4 different ways to get to that. So that'll be important. Finally, there's one extra question on the BOC survey that we've added. We're presently working on a study on UCL surgeries in high school baseball. We have done several studies at the college and a lot of the professional levels to look at the incidence and prevalence of UCL surgeries, but there's really no literature and no information on what's happening in high school. But we know that high school baseball players are experiencing UCL surgery. So we're trying to find how to do that. Now, what we've done before is do an anonymous survey to the players to ask them specifically if they've had a UCL surgery or not. It doesn't take very long. It's an online anonymous survey. And we'd like to do that in baseball. So we're looking for baseball, high school baseball or high school athletic trainers who might want to help us with this survey. And if you are on the BOC survey, you can check a box saying you're interested. We will contact you and see if you want to do that. We really would appreciate any of the high school ATCs help on this, whether they're on the episode or not. If you know them, you can try to get them to see if they can do that. It won't take very long. Okay, so we'll go to the speakers. Here are our 3 speakers. We're really happy to have these 3 people that pretty good expertise in early specialization, which, by the way, has not been around all that long. We think about 2010 was when people started talking about early specialization, maybe a little bit before that. One of the first ones that started doing early specialization was Eric Post. He's a PhD and an athletic trainer and assistant professor at Indiana State University. Our second speaker, he's going to be talking on early specialization in the female athlete. Our second speaker is Marisa Sheppard. She has her master's in athletic training and she works at Portage College. And she has written her master's thesis and was published on early specialization with college hockey players in regards to groin and hip injuries. And Michael Ciccotti, who really needs no introduction, he's one of the top sports medicine orthopedic surgeons in the country. He's the head team physician for the Philadelphia Phillies, also the president, the current president of the AOSSM, and he'll be talking on single sport specialization in sports in general. Okay, so we're going to go right to, oh, I'm sorry, we have one other thing. I wanted to make sure everybody understood that all our speakers do this is volunteer their time to do this. They're not paid. They're not doing anything. And one of the advantages is that we can keep the costs down so you can get your CEUs for free. So we want to thank them for taking their time and giving us their expertise. So it's really, really important that we have the highest quality speakers to speak at these presentations. Again, the CEUs, it's important to do the survey. Here is the link. This slide will be up again so you can do that. And if certificates will be mailed out the next week, but if there's questions, and sometimes there are, make sure you send all your information on the CEUs to Nancy Flynn and not to me. She's the one that does it all. nancypflynn2@gmail.com. Okay. So our first speaker is Eric Post. He's the assistant professor at the master's program at Indiana University. His current issues are in early specialization. He's done quite a lot of work on that, authored numerous studies on that, and he reviews multiple journals. So so he's the guy that approves your studies or not. Education, he was at University of Wisconsin-Madison for his bachelor's in athletic training. He did his master's at Illinois State University. His thesis was a correlation of shoulder and elbow kinetics with ball velocity in college baseball pitchers. He got his doctorate at University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2018. And his dissertation was the Association of Sports Specialization with Daytime Sleepiness and Perspectives of Coaches Regarding Youth Safety, Sports Safety. It's a hell of a title there, Eric. It's good. Okay. Currently, he's the assistant professor at Indiana State University. He works with researching, advising, and student supervision. He's a reviewer for a lot of the top journals, including AJSM Sports Health and the Journal of Athletic Training. He is previously a professor at San Diego State University in the School of Exercise and Nutritional Sciences, and he was the research assistant at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Orthopedics and Rehabilitation Department. And he got his athletic training graduate assistant at Illinois State University. He's authored over 30 articles just on sports specialization, in addition to other studies that he's done. So he was one of the first on board on sports specialization and the issues that accompanies it. So he's done more than just about anybody in regards to the volume. This is Eric and his wife, Megan, and her nephew, Jaden. It's all yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Stan. And thank you, Stan and Nancy, for having me as part of this. This is great. I was telling them yesterday, this is, in some ways it's a strange new world, but in some ways it's a lot preferential to, I'll go speaking at an actual physical conference and there'd be, 10 or 15 people in the crowd with the friends and family crowd. So having been able to present this information to right now over 500 people, it's a great opportunity. So thank you very much. And I've been really fortunate to be a part of some great research teams that were looking at sports specialization as this topic first started kind of coming about. So I've been very fortunate in that regard. And then tonight what I want to talk about is specific to the female athlete. So there's a lot of attention paid to obviously the professional sports and the big time for every article about baseball that's published, or every 15 articles that's published about baseball, there's maybe one article about, softball. So I want to kind of bring some attention to that population. So no conflict of interest. These are our objectives. I'm going to talk about sports specialization, just to kind of give a background, which will hopefully set up, all three of these presentations. And then I'm going to talk about recent research specific to the female youth athlete. And then at the end, talk a little bit about recommendations for parent coaches and athletes about regarding sports specialization. So what can we do, as clinicians when we're talking to parents and talking to coaches and talking to kids? So just to kind of set the stage here tonight, everybody that's on this call, we all know the benefits of, sport participation and physical activity, and it's not just, within the sports specialization world, it's very outcome focused in terms of getting better at your sport and getting a scholarship. But really, we want kids to be active for a whole number of reasons, for their, social well-being, for their physical well-being, and all of those really important things. But I always like to start with this slide. I think everyone that's involved with youth sports and the youth sports landscape understands that things, seem to have changed and seem to have changed very quickly, where, youth sports may have looked like this for many of us when we were kids. And now it looks more like this, where you have, rankings of 9 U teams. And I don't really know, why 9-year-olds need to be ranked, but apparently they are being. And I thought for the female youth athlete, I should look and see, what does this look like for the female youth athlete? And so this is from prepvolleyball.com. This is the top 150 players in the country in the class of 2024. All right. And I like this disclaimer at the bottom. The information displayed below wasn't always easy to find, as these athletes have yet to begin high school volleyball. So we're already ranking the top 150 athletes in the country. And yet these athletes have never played a single match in high school, which shows kind of, where this crazy world of sports specialization has gone. So before we can talk about sports specialization or study it, we really have to define it. And so this is the AMSSM definition: year-round intensive training in a single sport at the exclusion of other sports. So, research that's looked at sports specialization has tried to measure it a number of different ways. The simplest way to measure specialization is just to look at whether somebody is a single sport athlete or a multi-sport athlete. There's some issues with that. You can imagine a very casual high school athlete that only plays football to, be around their friends. They would be considered highly specialized, where you could have what we're really seeing the trend is, yes, they play multiple sports, but they're really focusing on one thing year round. And then they're stacking those other sports on top of that. And it becomes this huge sport volume issue. So Dr. Neeraj Gianti, who's at Emory University, developed this scale, this 3-question scale, which we've used in a lot of our research looking at sports specialization because it aligns with that AMSSM definition, and I think does a better job of classifying specialization. That being said, I know there's groups working on developing a new definition of specialization that better encapsulates all the different aspects that go into specialization, whether it's club teams, travel, the money spent on club sports, all those things. But this is the scale we've used, and it consists of 3 questions. So do you train or participate in your primary sport for more than 8 months out of the year? So that gets at that year-round component. Do you consider your primary sport more important than your other sports? Okay, so can you pick a main sport? And then have you quit other sports to focus on that primary sport? So have you focused down onto one sport? And so I'll present some results here throughout this presentation. I'm going to present them using this scale. So if you answer yes to all 3 of these questions, you'd be considered a highly specialized athlete. Whereas if you answer yes to only 2 of the questions, you're moderately specialized. If you answer yes to none of them or 1 of them, you're low specialization. So that'll be that green, yellow, and red that I present some results with. Now, is specialization linked with overuse injury? I think the overwhelming evidence at this point says yes. Specializing in a single sport increases your risk for overuse injury, and this is borne out in a number of studies now that have found, either prospective studies that have found increased risk of specialization or retrospective studies that have found increased odds or increased likelihood of reporting overuse injuries. So there's growing evidence. Like Stan was saying, really starting around 2010, the evidence is starting to accumulate with a number of studies that in various samples across the country are finding this increased association with overuse injury. But what about the female youth athlete? So, we know specialization may be linked with overuse injury overall, but, one thing I want to get across in this presentation is that, and I think we'll have a great opportunity to see this through the presentations tonight, is that, specialization is something that is context specific. So it may be, in certain sports, specializing may have a greater risk than in other sports. And, maybe for female athletes versus male athletes, the risks are different. There's a couple great epidemiological papers published in 2015 by separate study groups, but they use these nationwide databases, the High School Rio database, to look at overuse injury rates in high school athletes. And what they found is that the overuse injury rates were about 50% higher in female athletes versus male athletes. And that was when they looked at all sports and also when they did sex-matched sports. So female track and field versus male track and field, they found the same thing, that there was an increased risk of overuse injury among female athletes. I'm actually part of a group. We're doing a follow-up kind of replication study of this where we're doing more recent data. These two studies looked at data 2010 to 2015. We're looking at another national database from 2015 to 2020. And we found the same thing. We're still working on this paper, but it's the same exact finding. Female athletes are at greater risk of overuse injury rates. And there's a number of reasons, why that may be. What I want to present here is the fact that specialization may be one component of that, of why we see these greater overuse injury rates among female high school athletes. So, like I said, I was lucky to be a part of a group at the University of Wisconsin that was really interested in this, with Dave Bell, Tim McGuine, Allison Brooks. They were all, really interested in this topic of sports specialization. And as a, eager grad student, I was kind of able to latch on to this question. And so in some of our earliest papers about this, what we started to really try to find out, and what we found almost by accident, is this differences between male and female youth athletes with regard to sports specialization. So when you look at the overall prevalence of sports specialization, this is in two different studies. We found, a little over a third of all athletes were highly specialized. But when we compared that male versus female, this was the first kind of finding where we saw that female youth athletes were more likely to be categorized as highly specialized compared to male athletes. So this was kind of our first evidence that there may be some sort of sex difference between male and female athletes in regard to the degree of sports specialization. And greater differences there, where we really see these dramatic sport effects in terms of the rates of sports specialization. So again, take this with a grain of salt, because this is in Wisconsin, but in our sample, over half of the volleyball athletes, which were all females, were highly specialized, compared to just a quarter of the baseball athletes. So of course, in Wisconsin, you can't really play baseball year round. We've looked at some data comparing baseball players in California versus Michigan versus Alabama. And there is a big geographical component too. So if you're able to play year round, you're going to be more likely to specialize. But the bottom line is there are a lot of sex effects and sport effects on specialization. So specialization is something that's not equal across the board. It's happening in different settings, which we'll talk about throughout these results. So after that first study, we did a follow-up study just to specifically look at the associations of sports specialization and kind of the behaviors surrounding sports specialization. So participating in a huge volume of games per year. A lot of these travel teams, they play in competitions way more than they practice. Okay, they'll go to a weekend tournament and play 4 or 5 games over the course of a weekend. And so we wanted to look at some of those factors that are connected with sports specialization and see how those are connected with sex among high school athletes. So we did a project where we tracked over 1,500 high school athletes over the course of an entire school year. It was about 50-50 male and female. And we tracked them, we had the athletic trainers follow them and track their athletic exposures and injury data over the course of an entire school year. And what I was interested in is to see what are the differences in kind of sports specialization behavior between male and female athletes. So one of the questions we asked was, how many competitions have you participated in the previous year? So they were able to tell us, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. How many games have you played basically in the last year? We asked them to look back, think back, and think about how many games they've played. Our highest category was greater than 60 competitions. And honestly, we put it in there because we didn't think we'd get that many responses. So we thought, okay, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, 50 to 60. We're sick of making these categories. The last category is going to be greater than 60 competitions. And what we found was that of all of the female athletes in this study, nearly 1 in 4 responded that they had participated in more than 60 competitions in the past year. So that's a schedule that is on par with any professional league outside of Major League Baseball, right? And exceeds a lot of the professional leagues in what they're doing in terms of competition value or competition volume, right? So again, I just want to pause on that. 23% of all of the female high school athletes in our survey responded that they had participated in more than 60 games in the past year. When you compare that to male athletes, only 1 in 10 male athletes responded that they had played more than 60 competitions. So there's a huge discrepancy between this competition volume between females and males. So now we're starting to see maybe potentially some of those underlying reasons for the differences in overuse injury rates. We asked whether or not they had played on a club team in addition to their school team. Okay, so do you play on a club soccer team in addition to your high school soccer team? the majority of female athletes said yes, they played on a club team in addition to their school team, compared to just 37% of male athletes. So again, these huge differences that show up in terms of the overall sport volume that these youth athletes are sustaining. When we looked at how many kids were classified as highly specialized, again, same thing as we saw in our previous study, female athletes, these differences were not as dramatic as the club sport differences, but there were more highly specialized female athletes. 16% were highly specialized versus just 10% of the male athletes. So these big differences in terms of their sport participation behavior. Now, with all that being said, we've shown that, you know, specialization can be sex specific, but like we talked about, it's also sport specific, right? A lot of these early studies that we did, we had these huge cohorts of kids that played all different types of sports, but obviously not all sports are created equally. You know, overuse injury risk is going to be different, and the effects of specialization and repetitive motion are going to be different between different sports. So, you know, some sports have a very broad movement profile, soccer, basketball, while other sports, baseball, pitching, you know, tennis, swimming, cross country, have a much more limited and repetitive movement profile. And a great paper that came out a couple years ago now showed that there's also differences based on team sports versus individual sports. So they found specialized athletes in individual sports had an increased rate of overuse injury compared to specialized athletes in team sports. So there's all these different, you know, specialization exists in all these different contexts, and, you know, the risks are going to vary based on those contexts. So that's what we really want to follow up on, is this paper we published last year, specifically looking at what are those sport specific contexts that specialization occurs in, and how do those interact with sex. So we recruited a sample over 700 youth athletes, and we recruited from 3 sports. So we recruited from basketball, and we recruited both boys and girls basketball. We recruited from soccer, both boys and girls soccer, and volleyball. And we only recruited girls volleyball because it's much more popular than boys volleyball in the area where we're recruiting from. And it's one of the most popular girls sports nationwide. So we tried to get the most popular youth sports, basketball, soccer, and girls volleyball, and recruited them from local tournaments. And really, we were interested to see how does specialization differ by sport, and how does specialization interact with sex? So we found that female basketball athletes were nearly 4 times more likely than males to report an overuse injury. So going back to those epidemiological studies, our findings lined right up with that the female athletes more likely than males to report an overuse injury, but that was specific within basketball. Specialization was not associated with overuse injury among basketball or soccer athletes. It was only associated with overuse injury among female volleyball athletes. So again, we look at this, you know, interaction between a sport, volleyball, that has a much more limited movement profile compared to basketball or soccer, much more repetitive in terms of the jumping and in terms of the movements. And then also female athletes, which we know are at a greater risk for overuse injury. So you start to combine these different factors where you have a limited movement profile sport with female athletes, and you can see why, you know, the risks of specialization related to overuse injury, you really start to get, you know, a dangerous mix there. So that's what we've seen in terms of, you know, specialization and its effects within sex. What I want to kind of finish up with here is, you know, now that we know, or we're starting to get an understanding that specialization is associated with injury, well, why do people do it? Okay, what's the perceived benefit? Because we really have to understand that in order to be able to, you know, as clinicians, affect change or have these conversations with our, you know, our athletes and their parents. So the 10,000 hour rule, I'm sure many of you that are watching are familiar with that. It's the idea originally developed in a study of violinists that you need to attain 10,000 hours of deliberate practice in order to obtain expertise in a skill. This was applied to all different skills within Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. And so a lot of people have used this and applied it to sports and decided this is the best way for a youth athlete to become an expert at that sport, with the ultimate goal of that youth athlete getting a scholarship or professional contract. So, you know, Stan mentioned at the beginning, starting to see this really appear in 2010. Well, why would that happen? Well, the parents that were growing up and then having kids that were coming, you know, into their teens in the 2010s, you know, who are the sport idols that they've grown up with? You've got huge examples of this early specialization, early investment model that, you know, you see these in the media, and you see these as the models of the, you know, some of the greatest athletes of this generation. And so that, I think, it's transmitted as that's the way to really increase sport expertise. There's a couple of great studies I want to talk about that looked at the factors that drive youth sports specialization, talking to kids and talking to parents. They surveyed 2 separate studies. In one study, they surveyed youth athletes, and the other study, they surveyed parents. In the survey of youth athletes, they found 70% wanted to play college or professionally. I don't have any issue with this. I don't have issue with youth athletes wanting to play in college professionally. I wanted to. When I was a kid, I thought I'd be defensive end for the Green Bay Packers. Part of me is still hoping they'll call. We'll find out. But I don't have an issue with that. On the other hand, about a third of these kids said that a coach had told them to specialize. So obviously there's this adult influence that's saying the way to attain sport expertise is to specialize in the sport. When I surveyed the parents of youth athletes, now this is where I start to have an issue. I don't mind if 70% of kids want to play in college or professionally, but when 60% of parents are hoping for their child to play in college or professionally, then we start to get these unrealistic expectations. And about half of them are encouraging their child to specialize. So you really have these adult factors. These are, the adults in the room are the ones that are encouraging specialization. We did a study of high school baseball parents in the San Diego area. And so we asked them, how much does specializing increase your child's chances of making a college team? The majority of them said that specialization would increase their child's chances of making a college team either quite a bit or a great deal. So this mindset is pervasive. It's out there that specialization is the way to get your kid onto a college scholarship. But the numbers don't really back this up. Even if we just look at the data for youth female athletes, you've got almost 4 million youth basketball players. Of those, only 14,000 will end up playing in college. So you've got 0.4% ultimately playing in college, and not all of those athletes are going to receive a scholarship, as we know, if they're not playing Division I. So there's this huge disconnect between the 60-70% of parents that want their kid to specialize and think their kid's going to play in college versus the less than half of 1% who ultimately do. And what does the research actually say about specialization in sport performance? So in reality, is specialization necessary for elite sport performance? It doesn't seem to be. The research that exists has shown that there's multiple pathways to becoming an expert at something. And some research shows multiple sport athletes are more likely to compete at a national level, and that the elite athletes specialize at a later age and train less in childhood. So there's multiple pathways to becoming an elite in sports, and specialization is not the only pathway that's available. So does early sports specialization really make a difference? This is one of my favorite papers on this topic. It just came out a couple years ago. This group out of UCLA, they compared the sport participation history of NCAA Division I athletes and a matched sample of non-athlete undergrads, because they were looking at what are the differences between these two groups that predict this group ending up as a Division I athlete. They found no differences in between these groups in terms of sport start age or age of specialization. So starting at a young age or specializing at a young age, there were no differences between the kid that's playing Frisbee on the quad versus the starting quarterback, right? The only difference that they saw was that the NCAA athletes were more likely to have siblings or parents who played collegiately or professionally, right? So it was not anything about how long they've been playing their sport or when they started focusing in their sport. It was all about, that environment and that genetic component. So I want to finish up here with some recommendations. What can we do now as clinicians to try to, let parents and kids and coaches know that specialization is not the only route towards success. You let them know, inform them about volume recommendations. So don't participate in a single sport for more than 8 months out of the year. Take a season off from playing your sport. Take a few days off per week. Use that 3-point Gianti scale to classify youth athletes, and then have that conversation with them. According to this, you're highly specialized, and that could increase your risk of overuse injury. Try to have some of those conversations. Caution against playing multiple sports leagues simultaneously. I think that's one of the big things we're seeing now is that it's not just specializing in a single sport. It's that investment in that single sport where you're on not just your high school softball team, but you're playing on 2 travel teams as well, and you're overloading all of those practices. I think there's myths that we have to work to dispel within the youth sports community. Specialization is not necessary to play at an elite level. There's a lot of different pathways to success. And the 10,000 hour rule, was originally developed in concert violinists. So it may not be necessarily a valid framework for youth sports. And really, when you look at the pathways of elite athletes, a lot of them follow a pathway of early sampling, followed by eventual specialization in late adolescence. So age 15, 16, finally specializing around that age. So there's a lot of different pathways to being a successful athlete. And really, we need to frame success. It's not just about, being the best in your sport and getting a college scholarship. Participating in youth sports should be about so much more, about gaining skills, about friendship, about physical activity. American Academy of Pediatrics, so some more recommendations they provide, but it falls along the same lines. Delay specialization till mid to late adolescence. encourage your child to participate in multiple sports. And of course, it's American Academy of Pediatrics, so they recommend to speak with a pediatrician. But speak with, a healthcare provider. As the athletic trainer in a secondary school setting, you have a great opportunity to have these conversations with parents and kids about what are their goals, what are we hoping to get out of youth sports, and how can youth sports be, so much more than just a drive to get a scholarship. They encourage taking a few months off during the year, and also taking 1 to 2 days off per week. So an easy way to think about that would be, take a season off from your sport each year and take a couple of days off per week from your sport. I think this is summed up. We can simplify all these recommendations down. There's this famous quote from Michael Pollan with regard to trying to synthesize a bunch of nutritional advice, right? Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. I obviously don't follow this, but it's out there, right? But what can we do for youth sports if we want to simplify these recommendations? Play a variety of sports, not year-round in a single sport. And if you're a kid, play mostly unorganized sports. Be a kid, right? Have fun. You don't need to have a referee around to be playing your sport. You can play it with, heaven forbid, kids in your neighborhood. So like I said, I've been lucky to be a part of a lot of great research teams and worked with some, really outstanding researchers and individuals. So I want to, thank all of them, and also, provide some thanks for all the organizations that have funded a lot of this work. And thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and the Q&A session at the end.
Eric, very, very, very good, very comprehensive. A lot of good questions to ask in that. So we'll see you in a little bit. We're going to introduce our next speaker. Marisa Sheppard. I found Marisa Sheppard in her article that she published just recently in 2020. I thought it was pretty interesting. I wanted to have some specialization on something that was a little different other than baseball, basketball, football, or volleyball. And she had done some work in collegiate ice hockey. She was an ice hockey player, an ACH Division I hockey player at Adrian College in Michigan. So she not only studied the sport, but she played the sport. The name of her article that she just published from her master's thesis is Early Specialization in Subjective Hip and Groin Dysfunction in College Ice Hockey Athletes, including male and female, which is the other important thing that I think is looking at the male and female differences. Portage College is where she's at now. Her education is a bachelor's at Adrian College in Michigan. She got her master's in athletic training at Adrian, and again was a Division I hockey player in here. I think this is her right here. I'm not sure, but I think that's
that's me.
That's her. Okay, good. Currently, she's an athletic therapist, which I guess is what they call athletic trainers in Canada, at Portage College in Alberta. She is a primary author on this study, which I think takes a lot of guts to do, to publish that right out of school. And here is her family. I have the names here. Tom and Linda is his parents, and
Neil is my brother.
Neil.
And Howard the dog.
Howard's the dog, okay? And she, in this picture here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, that's her right here as the athletic trainer. Okay, Marisa, it's all yours.
Perfect, thanks, Stan. How do I? There we go. Is it working?
Yep, it's good. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so as Stan mentioned, I went to school in Adrian, played hockey there. And so for my master's thesis, I studied the effects of sport specialization on subjective hip and groin disability in female and male collegiate hockey players. So with this, my professor is John Gutchis, and we also had our athletic trainer, Jim McNair, help out with this as well. So just a little bit of a background. So when I started my research, obviously I had to come up with a topic. And so I knew I wanted to do something with hockey. and I knew I wanted to focus on the hip joint. So I've been playing hockey my whole life, and maybe around say 16 or so, when hockey got a little bit more intense, I began noticing I had some pain in my hips. And then, I'd be sitting in class in high school, and my hips would be painful. And then this was even greater once I was in college. And then once I began my exercise science athletic training education, I became more aware that I had, decreased range of motion in my hips, as well as pain with that too. So that's why I kind of wanted to do it for my thesis research, just, to try and learn a little bit more about myself, make it more personal. And then it was actually Dr. Gutchess who brought up sports specialization. I hadn't really heard of it before, but it sounded like something worthwhile, and so that's how we came up with this topic. So as Dr. Post mentioned, sports specialization, it's fairly new to the research, but it's been defined as year-round intensive training in a single sport at the exclusion of other sports. So specifically in hockey, it's very prevalent, and it's becoming a concern. Hockey Canada and USA Hockey both they put out training recommendations to try and help parents and coaches with the development of their youth athlete. And both of these have stated that they recommend a 9-month training season, as well as beginning sport-specific training as early as ages 11 and 12. So, that information is being put out to parents and coaches and athletes, to almost saying that they should start specializing to try and create an elite athlete or a professional. So we know sports specialization leads to an increased risk of overuse injury, psychological burnout, and decreased neuromuscular control. And then with this overuse injury, the three classifications, we've seen that highly specialized athletes have an 81% greater risk of developing overuse injuries than those who are lowly specialized, as well as an 18% greater risk than those who are moderately specialized. And even those who are moderately specialized are at a 39% greater risk of developing overuse injuries than those who are lowly specialized. So you can see it's very, it can be very detrimental to the body, and then especially early specialization with developing bodies. So in hockey, hockey players are at an increased risk of sustaining hip and groin injuries than those in other sports. Hip and groin injuries are the second most common injury among female NCAA D1 athletes, and the third most common injury among female CIS athletes. So that's Canadian intersports, inter-university sports, sorry. So that's the Canadian equivalent to NCAA. As well, youth hockey players have been shown to be at a 15 times greater risk of developing femoroacetabular impingement. So that's pretty substantial, compared to their non-hockey playing counterparts. So all of this, we kind of asked the question, so what role would sports specialization play on hip and groin injuries in hockey players? We thought about the unique biomechanics of skating. So when you stride out, your hip is at maximal extension with external rotation and abduction, and then when you're bringing your leg back in, when the other leg is striding, you're forcing it into flexion with internal rotation and adduction all at the same time. So it's the hip joint. You think it is a ball and socket joint, but generally it's mainly used for moving in the sagittal plane. So with skating, you're moving in all of these other planes at higher forces. So that in itself is detrimental, can cause injury as well. But with that, you add on the repetition of how often you're skating, and then when you're specializing, that's even more. And then the amount of time you're doing it. So when you're specializing, it's generally 8 months of the year. So that added on could lead to chronic stresses on those tissues at the hip. So the purpose of our study, we wanted to see whether hockey players who are highly specialized during their youth years reported greater subjective hip and or groin disability compared to those who are low or moderately specialized. So first, we had our participants fill out just a demographic questionnaire. We asked their sex, age, height and weight, and then we also asked which country they're from. And then we asked how many years they've been playing organized hockey, as well as the current level they play and their position, their current position. Then we handed out the 3-point specialization questionnaire. We tailored this questionnaire to ask them to answer before grade 9 of high school. So before they were in high school, where they specialized. We also tailored the questions a little bit just to make it easier for our participants, just so there wasn't any confusion on it. So we asked, did you quit other sports to focus on hockey? Did you train for more than 8 months out of the year in hockey? And did you consider hockey more important than other sports? So as Dr. Post said, if you answer yes to all 3 questions, that would give you 3 points and make you highly specialized. If you answer yes to 2 questions, you'll be moderately specialized. And if you answer yes to only 1 or none of the questions, then you're low specialized. So that we were able to categorize all of our participants into those 3 groups. Next, we had them fill out the hip and groin outcome scale. It's a questionnaire that's broken into 6 subscales: symptoms, pain, activities of daily living, sport and recreation, participation in physical activities, as well as quality of life. It's on a 5-point Likert scale from 0 to 4 points. And with this scale, a score of 100 would mean no hip or groin disability, so high function. And then a score of 0 would mean extremely high hip and groin disability, so low function. Among our participants, we had 81 females and 106 males. There were no significant differences in these demographics, other than we found the high and moderate males had played significantly more years of organized hockey than those who were in the low specialization group. So these are our results. Everything that has a blue star on it means that it was significant. So this is our females. You can see the Hago subscales along the bottom. And then, so as if it's closer to 0, right, they're at a greater disability. And then we have our low, moderate, and high in green, yellow, and red. So we saw a significance between high and low specialization groups in all categories except for physical activity. And then I also think it's worth mentioning that the physical activity subscale only had 2 questions in it. So that kind of, has an effect as well. So we thought that was very, a very significant outcome here. There was also a significance between the high and moderate quality of life, as well as pain and symptoms. And then when we look at the men, we see a little bit different outcomes here, but there's significance between the highly specialized group and low specialized group in quality of life, as well as differences between the moderate and low groups in quality of life, physical activity, activities of daily living, and symptoms. I think that these results are pretty telling. We think that the quality of life has a greater significance there. It's very interesting to us that it doesn't seem to be affecting their sports, but their quality of life is being affected. So through the study, it was pretty clear, and then as well as doing, reading other studies that have been done, that if you're specialized and highly specialized, you will have greater disability. So yeah, like I said, it's similar to those overuse injuries articles. We see it's more evident in females than males. We see that the hip and groin injuries are more prevalent among the female hockey players than the males. And it's been shown that NCAA female athletes are at a greater risk for overuse injuries. So, we wonder, does this have to do with female hip anatomy versus the male's anatomy? Does this change the biomechanics of skating between females and males? It might be something worth looking at. I think this study and these findings are very important to include in youth and parent education. Make sure that parents and coaches and anyone involved in youth sports are aware of the implications that specializing have. Decrease the amount of time, increase the variety of sports that kids are playing. Could sports specialization be a risk factor to chronic disability? So our results, our females averaged 71 to 89% across subscales. So that means a higher disability. And the males averaged 75 to 93% across subscales. So these are pretty high numbers when you're thinking about pain and other symptoms, activities of daily living, that sort of thing. One of the things we thought about is that our participants, they're supposed to be healthy athletes. One of our exclusion criteria was if they have missed the past week of hockey. So all of our participants have been playing at least for the past week. And so that should mean that they're healthy athletes. But what this is saying is that these athletes are still experiencing, this level of disability, whether it be pain or decreased range of motion, whatever it may be. Maybe these athletes aren't, as healthy as we think they are. As well with this, the disability doesn't necessarily result in time loss. So like I said, they've all been participating at least for the past week, despite the disability that they're experiencing. So clearly these disabilities, may not be affecting them in their sport, but what about their life outside of sport, or, their years later on, their future? How will it affect them then? And are these disabilities early signs of chronic issues down the road? So I think that's something that, deserves a look into research. Some limitations this research had, it was retrospective, so we're relying on our college athletes' memory to recall their time prior to high school, recall what their sports were, what they were playing, that sort of thing. We also had a limited number of participants and a focus level of college athletes. So this study didn't include any D1 athletes. It was NCAA D3 and then all levels of ACHA hockey. We did this study at a small Michigan college, and so we had limited access to participants. But I think maybe in the future it would be good to look at Division I athletes as well, and maybe even into the professional level. So as well, I think looking at skating biomechanics with specialization would be worthwhile, as well as specialization and injury history, and maybe even doing a prospective study, have a group of youth athletes and follow them throughout their careers to see, you know, did they specialize, did they not, and what sort of injuries or disabilities are they experiencing because of it. So that's all I've got. You know, thank you for listening. Thanks to Stan and Nancy for inviting me on here. Hope I was able to shed some light on some things.
Marisa, you did great. We had a sort of talk Marisa into doing this talk. It's her first big talk. We probably shouldn't have told her that there were going to be 900 people on listening to her, but she did tremendously. And one of the disadvantages of virtual Zoom conferences is you can't hear the applause. So I'll give you some right now. Very, very good.
Thank you.
Okay, so go ahead and there we go. Okay. Let's go to our last speaker. Mike Ciccotti. I'm going to shorten this, Mike, just a little bit because it would take me about an hour to get through all your achievements in medicine as well as other things. But Mike is going to do the single sport specialization in athletes. He's done several studies on this. He's the director of sports medicine at Rothman Orthopedic Institute in Philadelphia. He's the current president of AAOSM, team physician and medical director of the Philadelphia Phillies, as well as, and this is impressive for me, he still works with the St. Joseph University Sports for more than 25 years. Sometimes we forget the high school and college is that we started off with, and now that he's in the professional ranks, you know, it's nice for him to still be doing that. We have a bunch of other things here, but I'm going to skip down to the important thing for me, and that he's the chairman of the Major League Baseball Medical Advisory Committee, which I work with sometimes. His education undergraduate at Holy Cross. He got his medical degree at Georgetown, orthopedic residency at Thomas Jefferson University, and did a sports medicine fellowship in the infamous or famous Kerlan Jobe Sports Clinic in Los Angeles. Again, the current president of AAOSM, which is a very big deal in orthopedics, especially in sports medicine orthopedics. Everett and Marion Gordon, professor of orthopedic surgeon, the chief of division of sports medicine, as well as director of sports medicine at Rothman. He's a head team physician for the Philadelphia Phillies, but also he's a consultant for the 76ers, the Eagles, and the Flyers. So he stays pretty darn busy. We elected not to count the number of articles he's written or been a part of, but he's done a lot of them. These two articles are specific to our talk on the youth single sport specialization in professional baseball and the early single sport specialization in athletes in high school and college. This is Michael and his wife Patty have 4 children, quite a group. Michael's an orthopedic surgeon, Matthew's a real estate developer, Emma's a marketing director in Boston, and Carly's a medical director in New York. Michael, you're on.
All right, you can go ahead and share your screen.
There we go. Well, thank you, Stan. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. And we just heard 2 great talks by Eric and Marisa on a topic that is very important to all of us. And what I would like to do over the next 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, is give you our perspective on single sport specialization in athletes. These are my disclosures, none of which have any direct correlation to this talk. 27 million athletes between the ages of 6 and 18 participate in team sports each year in the United States. And there absolutely is a rise in early specialization to single sport, with coaches, with parents, with athletes, all believing that this may be the most reliable way for them to move on to a higher level. And yet we all know, and we've heard this already in the first 2 talks, that a very small percentage of these high school athletes will ever make it to the most elite level. And yet many children focus on single sports year round, with the anecdotal cases of highly successful single sport athletes like Tiger Woods, like Lionel Messi. And there are multiple sources of pressure towards specialization, which we've heard about already: parents, peers, coaches. And no doubt the media also generates this type of enthusiasm, with advertisements for spring soccer starting at 18 months of age, and watching the exploits of young football players on Friday night tykes, and enjoying some of the greatest golfers in the world who are all under the age of 7. And as we've already heard, Eric and Marisa both pointed out that Malcolm Gladwell has helped to promote this with several of his ideas. This 10,000 hours, which as Eric said already, was initially directed and meant to describe violinists, but expertise and precision in a particular skill may be statistically improved with increased time practicing or performing the chosen activity. And this idea of the tipping point, the point at which a mere trend crosses a threshold and becomes this psychosocial phenomenon that affects the masses. Well, perhaps these two ideas are most appropriate with this idea of single sport specialization. And that baits the question, at what age is single sport specialization beneficial, or does it just risk injury? And therein lies the dilemma. So we understand the beneficial, helpful aspects of sport, a healthy, active lifestyle that's promoted in these young athletes. Their sense of self-image may be actually enhanced, particularly if they're successful in the sport. The relationships that they develop with teammates, with coaches, with other peers, and perhaps some of their skills may be improved with exposure to these sports. But then there's the potential harmful aspect. Overuse injuries on musculoskeletally developing bodies that are perhaps at one of the most fragile periods in their life. The pressure to succeed, which can be enormous on these athletes, and the reduced time just to play for play's sake. And with that then, burnout and social isolation if perhaps they are not as successful as they would like to be. And therein lies the dilemma that we deal with. And there is no doubt that this idea, this phenomenon of single sport specialization generates a tremendous amount of money across the United States. It costs a lot of money for these parents to enlist elite level coaches, to enlist their children in these multiple leagues, in these club teams and showcases, and it generates a significant amount of money for many people. So there's a huge financial aspect. And because of that, then, there have been consensus statements that have been developed by a variety of health organizations like this one from the AOSSM, where youth advocates, parents, clinicians, and coaches all need to work together with the governing bodies of those sports to ensure a healthy environment for these athletes to play and to compete that does not create a long-term health issue for them, but really supports their athletic competition at the level that he or she decides, their highest level. Well, that's what prompted us to really delve into this phenomenon of sports specialization and participate in several studies, two of which I'd like to review with you now. So single sport specialization in high school, collegiate, and professional athletes. And the purpose of our study was to determine the prevalence of single sport specialization in a group of athletes, again, high school, collegiate, and professional athletes, to compare the average age at which each group made the decision to specialize to one sport, and to evaluate any correlation that might exist between sports specialization and injury occurrence. So how did we do that? Well, we distributed a survey to over 3,000 athletes, as you see here, high school, collegiate, and professional. It was administered at their pre-participation evaluations by their certified athletic training staff in order to ensure that they completed the study and to help mitigate any misinterpretations they might have. And our definition of sports specialization, again, intensive, year-round, 8+ months per year. You've been hearing that in all three talks. Training and competition in a single sport to the exclusion of all other organized sports. And the survey consisted of a variety of demographic questions, current sport commitment, their injury history, their future athletic plans, and their perspectives on sports specialization. And the athletes were asked if he or she specialized to play one sport, what were the details pertaining to that particular decision. And we used appropriate statistical evaluation. So what did we find? Well, in terms of general demographics, we found that the current professional athletes, they began to compete in all types of varied sports at a statistically earlier age than the younger athletes, the collegiate and the high school athletes. They competed at an earlier age, but they competed in a broad spectrum of sports. And when we looked at specific specialization, though, we found that the youngest athletes in the study, they specialized at a statistically earlier age, on average 2 years younger than the older athletes, the collegiate and the professional athletes. When we asked them about history of any injury, the younger athletes recalled a statistically higher incidence of sport-related injury than the collegiate and the professional athletes. And when we asked them about their perspectives on specialization, we found that the current high school athletes, the younger athletes, were much more likely to feel that specialization enhanced their performance. It allowed them to perform better, and it would perhaps allow them to move on to a more elite level. And they would promote early specialization to their family members and to those that they loved. And then we looked at the Major League Baseball or professional baseball subgroup. And we looked at it specifically with respect to what was happening in those professional baseball players that were born in the United States and those that were born outside the United States. And we found that the non-US born players, they specialized at a statistically earlier age than the US born baseball players. When we looked at injury history, however, we found that those non-US born players, they were actually less likely to sustain what they would describe as a sports-related injury. And when we looked at perspectives on specialization, we found that those non-US born players, they were much more likely to feel that early specialization helped them. It enhanced their performance and allowed them to move on, and they would promote it to their family members. We looked at reasons for specialization and a variety of factors that we thought perhaps might be in play here. And we found that actually the pure enjoyment or passion for the sport was the number one reason for these athletes to specialize. And then we looked at specialization with respect to position players versus pitchers. And we found that there was no statistically significant difference in specialization rates or the age at specialization based on the position of these baseball players. We looked at it geographically, and we found that of the athletes who specialized in our cohort, the top 3 states they lived in were warm weather states, California, Florida, and Texas. So there's no doubt that these athletes, they exert tremendous forces through their bodies that perhaps when they're most fragile, when they are musculoskeletally developing and they're most at risk for injury. And sports specialization has been theorized by some groups as enhancing performance and increasing likelihood of participation at the most elite level. And it's been theorized that the most common motivation comes from a variety of sources: coaches, parents, organizations, peers, and media. And yet there's great concern, and we're here tonight, we're talking about it because there's great concern in the medical community with respect to the healthcare providers that take care of these athletes with respect to sports specialization. It's increased risk of injury and burnout with no true benefit of future elite level participation. So then that begs the question, does the end justify the means with early single sport specialization? And there is growing amount of information that has looked at this, and we've heard some excellent studies already in the first 2 talks. And certainly over the last 5 years, there's been an explosion of research on single sport specialization, multiple position statements, attitudes towards sports specialization, risk of injury with specialization, influences on these athletes to specialize, sex or gender relationship, socioeconomic status and how it might relate or impact single sport specialization, and then sports specialization in specific sports. All really asking the question, is single sport specialization beneficial or injurious? So if we look at these position statements, they're very consistent. A variety of sports societies and health organizations have published these statements, and they encourage a collaborative effort, like we have tonight here, by medical providers, with parents, with coaches, and with sports organizations to create the safest environment for play and competition, and to monitor these athletes for burnout, for overuse injuries, which might be reflected in how they're performing, to consider integrative neuromuscular training, to use periodization for these athletes, and to aid the athlete to achieve the highest level desired that they desire while ensuring their health and their well-being throughout. In terms of the attitudes that in sports specialization, the current young athletes have strong perspectives on sports specialization, with the large percentage believing that it will enhance their sports performance, it will lead to improved ability, and it will increase their likelihood of progressing to higher levels. And we debate and are talking about the validity of those points. In terms of risk of injury, we've heard already, again, multiple studies that identify increased risk of injury with sports specialization. Eric and his group, highly specialized youth baseball players have increased incidence of upper extremity overuse injury, particularly if they're pitchers and they play over 8 months per year. Specialized youth athletes with increased risk of serious injury and career-ending injuries. Moderate and high sports specialization associated with increased lower extremity injuries. So we see clearly there is a risk of injury. How about the influences? Well, sports specialization is influenced by multiple sources, and parents may very well be one of those major influencers. They influence these athletes' specialization by direct encouragement. And in the Padaki study that Eric alluded to, over 50% hope that their children would play collegiate or professional sports. And in the investment they make, the financial investment in elite coaching and enrollment in multiple leagues and teams, this puts pressure. It influences sports specialization in these young athletes. The study by Padaki looking at coaches' influence, and over a third of the athletes involved in this study felt that their coaches put a significant amount of pressure on them to play a single sport. And yet we found in our study that what we would ultimately all hope for was the intrinsic enjoyment or the passion of the sport really was the primary motivations. But there are a variety of influences, no doubt. How about gender or sex? Well, gender may be a factor in injury risk seen with early sports specialization. And female high school athletes who specialized had higher overuse injury rates in volleyball, basketball, and in soccer. How about socioeconomic factors? Well, school settings, so larger urban, suburban schools versus smaller rural schools, that may also be a factor on the incidence of sports specialization, with Bell and his group showing that athletes at these larger schools were much more likely to exhibit sports specialization patterns associated with increased risk of overuse injury. They were more often highly sports specialized. They played a primary sport more than 8 months per year, over 16 hours a week. They engaged in high competition volume, and they were participating in sports leagues outside the school. Well, how about specific sports? Well, yes, clearly, early single sport specialization has been correlated with increased risk of injury in multiple sports: baseball, wrestling, soccer, volleyball. The list goes on and on. So then that begs several questions. First of all, what is the definition of sports specialization? Is it months per year, 8 months, 10 months, 12 months? Is it hours spent just participating in the sport, or is it training time and competition? And are there varying degrees of stress that occur with the types and intensity of accompanying conditioning, strength, flexibility, endurance, cardiovascular training? Is the type of sport a factor? How does gymnastics compare with golf in terms of the stress it puts on these musculoskeletal developing athletes? Is the physiologic age of the athlete a factor? And we would all agree that these young athletes, there is a tremendous spectrum in their physiologic age. We can have some youth athletes who are almost at skeletal maturity and some that are just beginning. And how about the psychosocial maturity of the athlete? Is that a factor? The tremendous force or stress, rather, that single sport specialization can place on these young people. Well, as we've heard, the most common definition of single sport specialization is intensive year-round, 8+ months per year training and competition in that single sport to the exclusion of all other organized sports. And that's the definition we used in our study. Okay, so does sports specialization result then in enhanced performance and progression to elite level? Well, again, there are a variety of studies that we've talked about. There are many studies that have looked at Olympic level athletes, and they consistently show that the most highly successful Olympic athletes specialized at a statistically later age. So there really is no empirical evidence that indicates early sports specialization either enhances performance or leads to participation at an elite level. And then the most important question, does it increase the risk of injury? And these are but 3 of many studies that we've heard tonight that do show that there is evidence. Early sport specialization increases the risk of injury in these young athletes. So in our study, we noted that these younger athletes, they were choosing to specialize at a statistically earlier age than the current collegiate and current professional athletes in the study. So this would suggest that these younger athletes, they believe that sport specialization is necessary for advancement. But our finding that the current pro athletes in the study specialized later suggests that early sport specialization may not be necessary for advancement to the most elite levels. But these are different groups of athletes at different times in their athletic careers. And the current competition for high school athletes, it may be more intense than it was for the collegiate and the pro athletes that were in our study when they were of high school age. We found in our study that the current high school athletes recalled a statistically higher incidence of injury than the collegiate and the professional athletes. So this could suggest that early specialization may be a potential factor in the occurrence of early sport-related injury. But we know there are multiple factors that impact the occurrence of injury with sport. And all this current data was dependent on recall by all the athletes that were surveyed. In terms of perspectives, in our study, we noted that the professional athletes, they indicated a statistically higher likelihood of not encouraging their children to specialize in sport. So this could suggest the pro athletes, they may not feel that early specialization is either beneficial or necessary. But that perspective does come after having successfully achieved what they wanted, which was the most elite level status in sport. When we looked at the baseball subgroup, what do we know? Well, there is a lot of baseball research that has occurred over the past several years on sports specialization. The effect of early single sport specialization has been investigated at all levels of baseball. Highly specialized, sport-specific baseball players have increased history of upper extremity overuse injuries, specifically the elbow. We found that the majority of current professional ball players did not specialize as youths and would not encourage it. We know, though, that these athletes are performing incredibly complex activities. And these activities require tremendous balance throughout their body. And they're at an age where they're growing into themselves when they may be most at risk because they have inherent imbalances. So to stress them further by this type of excessive sport and early specialization may put them at risk. In our study, in terms of our professional baseball players, we noted that the non-US born players, they chose to specialize at a statistically earlier age than the current US born professional baseball players. So this could reflect the socioeconomic differences between non-US players, most often from Latin America, and US born players. But it may also reflect the reality that there are limited types of organized sports available in the native countries of these non-US players as compared to the broad spectrum of sports that US athletes have at their fingertips throughout the year. In our study, we noted that the current non-US born pro baseball players, they recalled a slightly lower incidence of sport-related injury. So this may reflect the year-round nature of US born players participating with numerous opportunities for heightened participation in multiple and, as we all know, often simultaneous leagues, going to showcases and clinics. But it may also reflect the lesser availability of healthcare access in these non-US born players' native countries, so that they don't recall actually being treated for an injury because they may not have had access or sought medical care. In our study, we noted that the current non-US players, they were statistically more likely to think early specialization is beneficial, and they would encourage their children to specialize. And this, again, may reflect the socioeconomic differences with relatively greater impoverished conditions in the non-US born players' native countries. We found the #1 reason for specialization was what we would ultimately hope for, which is really passion or enjoyment of the sport. And this suggests that personal motivation is a key factor. And it may refute the idea that coach and parental pressure is the strongest driver of youth sports specialization, but we know those are absolutely drivers. And of the athletes in our study that specialized, the top 3 states were warm weather states, and this may represent the year-round access that these athletes have from these states to play this game, and a likely higher proportion of athletes in Major League Baseball from these areas. But these studies do have limitations. They're cross-sectional studies with different groups of athletes at different ages. There's inherent recall bias, because we are asking them to recall if they had an injury that they believe was related to sport specialization. The surveys were translated for non-English speaking athletes, but they were done by Major League Baseball, which has decades of experience translating for non-English speaking athletes. And there was a variation in sports between the subgroups. So in terms of our study, its conclusions, the current high school athletes, they specialized at an earlier age. These younger athletes recall a higher incidence of sport-related injury. The older athletes or the pro athletes are less likely to promote early specialization. The non-US born professional baseball players, they chose to specialize earlier than US baseball players. The non-US baseball players were more likely to promote early specialization than the US players. So where do we go from here? What is important to think about in the future? Well, and both Marisa and Eric have touched on this, that we need to think about this in even a more granular way. We have to think about the biomechanical ways that youth athletes perform their sports versus adults, to look at it in a very specific way, and how their techniques, so that we can identify what might be potentially injurious techniques that put them at risk. We have to delve into the idea of basic science in terms of tissue properties and healing capabilities, and how they may vary from youth athletes to adult athletes. And we need to develop standardized sports specialization survey tools, agreeing on the definition of sports specialization, using the 3-point scale that both Marisa and Eric spoke about. So being consistent, if we all use the same language when we do these studies, then we can interpret each other's work in a more meaningful way. We need to continue to collect data on all types of athletes at all levels, which we are continuing to do at Rothman. And we need to do it prospectively. We need to collect longitudinal data with respect to the age of sport specialization in these young athletes, the actual incidence of sport-related injury, the type of injury, the type of treatment that they had. Did they have surgery? Were they able to come back? And were they able to come back at what they would perceive as their prior level of performance, or a higher level? And the likelihood of progression ultimately to elite level. And we're in the midst of doing these prospective studies as well. So in summary, the data confirms the low probability of progressing to professional level sports. Less than 1% of all US high school athletes will ever make it to the professional level. Single sport specialization is not cost efficient. The cost of elite coaching and these participation in leagues and teams and showcases, it far exceeds the average college scholarship benefit. The large majority of research does not support early single sport specialization. It doesn't enhance performance. It does not ensure progression to a higher level. And single sport specialization is associated with increased risk, musculoskeletal injuries in a variety of sports, as we've talked about here tonight, and the psychological stress and burnout that comes with it as well. But we can't just drop the mic here. We really have to continue on. We've identified this. We really have to deliver the message, and it's a hard message to deliver in this environment that we live in, where athletes and their parents, who may be, the best meaning, really want their children to move on to the next level. And this study, our studies, they're just one piece of the early sports specialization puzzle. We need to continue to educate parents and coaches and the medical caretakers and the athletes on the deleterious effects of sports specialization. We must provide them examples of successful elite level athletes who didn't specialize early in life and who made it to the most elite level. And we must provide alternative programs for these young athletes that incorporate in a balanced way strength and conditioning, mobility, flexibility, rest, and recuperation in a balanced way that doesn't put them at risk for injury, and that takes into account where they are at in their musculoskeletal lives. And in doing so, we will fulfill our responsibility as their healthcare providers to create the safest environment for sports participation for our future athletes. Thank you.
Just unshare you. There you go. Okay, great. Thank you very, very much. That was in depth. A couple things really quick. We're going to get the rest of the panel on. I forgot to tell the audience that we want our questions in the Q&A section below. I apologize for not doing that. We're just flashing up that poll that we gave earlier on the answers if you want those answers. So we'd like a few more Q&As on this stuff. I've got a bunch of questions. I'm sure the audience does too, but I didn't tell you exactly where to put the Q&A questions. So if you can go ahead and start putting your questions into that Q&A, we'll start pulling them out. Nancy, we got everybody on here?
Yes, we have everyone back.
Okay, great. I'm going to start a little bit with the culture a little bit, meaning different countries. You went into great depth about, there was a question earlier before the conference by someone in regards to Dominican players in baseball and specialization. We know that the Dominican specifically is baseball crazy. In addition, on the social economic issues, this is their way out of poverty in the Dominican Republic. So they're trying to get to the United States to make money, to get out of social economic poverty that most of those people in the Dominican that I've seen, the Dominican, unfortunately have. When we're talking about that culture of coming over and their specialization, I think you hit on a little bit their lack of other sports. Maybe you can go a little bit on that. Because sometimes it seems like that's a little deceiving to me, being in baseball, that they're going to specialize because that's kind of how they get out of poverty or get to the next level. So maybe you can address that a little more.
So, yes, I mean, Stan, that's a great point. And I know you've lived and breathed this like I have, seeing these players come from the Dominican. And as you very appropriately said, this is their way out. I mean, this is how they get out of impoverished state. And if they're talented, in addition to maybe getting to what they would perceive and their families would perceive as a better life, they become almost, demigods. I mean, they're huge persona in their country for what they've been able to accomplish. So it's hard to unwind them from that, right? Different perhaps in the United States, where that can still, of course, exist in the United States, no doubt. And there are many families in the United States who, for their son or daughter to get higher education, participating in a sport is important because they may not be able to afford it. So I think it's important for us to consider the socioeconomic aspects of this, whether it's in the United States or outside the United States. But baseball in the Dominican and our study really highlighted how it does occur outside the United States. And so it's hard to unwind them from that, Stan. And I think we have to be cognizant of it. So it sort of speaks to two things here. We're focusing on trying to dissuade young athletes and their parents from participating in the single sport early on. And we have, that's an important mission for us. But we also have to think about how do we take care of and deal with those athletes that, for reasons that we can't change, are going to do that. So we can't ignore them. It is what it is. And we have to do what we can to really safeguard them and educate them and guide them and be vigilant so that we can minimize the risk of injury. Maybe Eric and Marisa might have some comments on that too.
Yeah, Marisa, we talked about this during the week in regards to, we saw in your questionnaire, you did put Canada and USA, but we talked a little bit, maybe you can go in a little more detail on not just what country the skaters are from, but also their style of play. There's different styles of play from Europe to Canada to the United States. Maybe you can address that in regards to where these people get injuries, not just with sports specialization, but in general, do styles of play increase the chance of injuries?
Yeah, so we decided to include country first because at Adrian College, I'd say, at least half of our hockey players are Canadian. And then, maybe the other half would be American. And then we do actually have quite a few from Europe. So the main reason I wanted to include that is because when I grew up, seeing all my friends grow up and everything, and my Canadian teammates, we all played a ton of sports growing up, all throughout high school. None of us were necessarily specialized, but we all ended up in the same place playing college hockey. And then I found out a lot of my American teammates, hockey was all they played, and it was all they played in high school and all of that. So I was more so interested in including it for the specialization component of it, to see if there was differences between the highly moderate and low specialization groups between the countries. And then, as you mentioned, the style of play, between the North American style of play is generally more, people describe it as more physical. So their strategy is to hit an opponent, to get the puck down, or they'll dump the puck deep in a zone and go dig for it along the boards, and hitting people and that sort of thing. Whereas the European style of play, people describe it as a lot more of like a puck possession game. So they like to hold on to the puck, and they pass to their teammates strategically, and it's a lot less contact between players. So the style of play is very different. And then you have Europeans coming to North America who essentially have to change their style of play. And then you also have people who grow up in North America going over and playing, in the KHL or something like that. So, that could be cause for injury too.
Nancy, you got a question from the audience?
Yep, this one's from Paul. Are there any noted differences in skating mechanics between females and males due to differences in pelvic width, acetabular version, muscle force, capsular laxity, etc.?
Marisa,
To me. Okay. Like we tried to do a little bit of research on that when I was doing my study, but we weren't really able to find anything on the specific biomechanics of skating, and then especially between genders, but or between the sexes. But just with my own knowledge of skating, me and my professor kind of broke it down. So we're not sure if there are differences. You'd think there might be. We posed the question of the wider pelvic anatomy of females, and with that, the increased angles and forces on the knees and everything. So there could be, but I haven't come across anything saying specifically if there is.
Nancy, the question for Eric.
Eric, do you feel if baseball is able to be played year-round in Wisconsin, that it would have the highest rate of overuse injuries among youth athletes that specialize in one sport?
I'd say maybe. I think, one thing I should say is that I think baseball is starting to be played year-round in Wisconsin. It's starting to be played year-round everywhere, because there's this intersection between, club sports and sports specialization. And, it's a great point that there's huge money involved in all this, right? And so these organizations, I know in Wisconsin, in the Midwest here, they're starting to build these big facilities where they can host year-round indoor whatever, whether that's indoor soccer or baseball or whatever that may be. And, and that's a great business to be in, because you bring in these teams every weekend of the year, and charge them tournament fees. And it's a nonstop, revenue source to have these club teams coming in. So, I don't know if baseball specifically, if we did a sport comparison, which sport would have the highest rate of overuse injury rates. I know in some of the epidemiological studies that I referenced, the highest rates of injuries they saw were in girls cross country, girls lacrosse, girls track and field, girls field hockey. So it's all within the female sports. So, that lead me to believe that even if baseball was being played year-round in Wisconsin, and it increasingly is, I think, those female, for whatever reason, there's that increased risk among female athletes. But I would say, just to raise that point of the club sports environment, it's becoming so pervasive and such a huge moneymaker that, when I talk to parents as part of these surveys, yes, you get the crazy parents that we've all heard of every once in a while, but a lot of parents just kind of feel caught up in this system of keeping up with what their peers are doing, what the other parents are doing, what the other kids are doing. My son's best friend is on this club team, so I feel like I need to be on the club team. And, you know, when we talk about the Dominican Republic, it's interesting because what I've seen here is from the studies is that it's kind of the opposite effect where, you know, club sports are making it very exclusive. Whereas in the Dominican, specialization is a route for kids to get out of poverty. In the US, it seems like it's more, you know, specialization is reserved for the kids that can afford to play on these teams year round and can afford to be on club teams and can afford to be on travel teams.
Yeah, that's a great point, Eric. I think. Do you want to say something, Michael? Because I think you're.
Yeah, I was just going to, yes, Stan, I was just going to follow up and say too, another aspect of this is, you know, it's the incidence of injury, but it's also, if you take it one level more, it's the type of injury, right? And the impact that injury has on the athlete, because we know that there are, you know, some overuse injuries that can allow us to check off a box on a survey or a study, but they are less impactful. And then there are other injuries that occur. Like if we just think back into baseball and we think about, you know, elbow injuries, and we think about, you know, the most common injury that we're going to see. And we've done epidemiologic studies as you have, Stan, on, you know, UCL injuries. And that's a long time. I mean, that's a year plus out of an athlete's career. So it's not just that the injury occurs, it's also the type of injury that I think is important. And Eric and Marisa, you might have some comments on that.
Well, I'll just say, I'll pass it to Marisa because I thought that's why her study was great, because it looks not just at the injury, but at the quality of life, at the, you know, at all those kind of things that, yeah, you're right. We think about the injury as it happens and we treat it, but that has long downstream consequences for that individual.
Yeah, the quality of life component of that was the thing that we thought was most interesting about the study, most eye-opening about the study. You know, these athletes are able to compete, you know, you would say as normal. You know, they're not missing practice, they're not missing games, but they are still, you know, injured technically. And, you know, the fact that they are reporting that they have a decreased quality of life was, you know, pretty shocking to us.
So let's, you know, going back to the all-around baseball in Wisconsin, just to give you some more facts. You know, it's been on and on that warm weather states cause more UCL injuries and shoulder injuries than the cold weather states. If you come from that, like in high school, the NCAA study that we did with 294 Division I baseball programs showed that gap is closing. That we saw UCLs where they had them in high school and college where they were the percentage, it was still a slightly statistically significant difference, but they're getting closer because now you have field houses that they work in. And then the other part is a fascinating thing that is happening, and Eric touched on it, and I want to emphasize it. High school, from baseball standpoint, I can't go to other sports, but I can go to baseball. High school baseball is secondary to the club and the travel team. So what you're having is some good, talented people skip their high school season, which is unthinkable in years past. And the travel team, and part of the way the travel team sort of pulls them in is that you're invited. You don't try out, you're invited. It's like a draft. And so it's really tough for the kid to say no to the travel team because it's such an honor, and maybe his friends didn't get asked and that kind of thing. So you get into all those things. We have another question here I want to get to that's sort of along this line that I wanted to bring up anyway. Glenn asked this thing about sports specialization and thinking about two-sport athletes. I think Dr. Ciccotti, I think in your study, I'm going to mix up the studies, talked about the college levels and when they specialized. And I would think that all of them specialized in one sport at the college level, but yours was like 80% have specialized in college, meaning there were other people who didn't, which brought me into thinking about the two-sport guy and the two-way player that we're seeing now, which is increasing the amount of intensity and volume of overuse. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're right, Stan, in that we did have athletes that were not sport specialized, and they were in college, in that they didn't fit the full criteria, and meaning that they played more than one sport. And so that's our, is what we're talking about. And our goal is to have these athletes participate in multiple sports. So they're stressing and they're exerting forces through the different parts of their musculoskeletal system in a way that hopefully is balanced and that allows them to maintain strength and endurance and flexibility in a way that then allows them to perform their sport well. So I think that's essentially is our, is our goal for these athletes. But the reality too is that when they get to, certainly at a collegiate level, if they're in a Division I school or a Division II school, and certainly Division III schools, depending upon the sport, it's hard to do that when they have the amount of time commitment to play a sport. If they're a recruited athlete and they're recruited for a sport, they may not have time to participate in another sport. They may have the ability to rest and recuperate, but they may not have time to participate in a second sport. But I would just add, though, that it's not just that you play organized sports. I mean, we could argue that just playing non-organized sport, pick up recreational basketball or frisbee or street hockey or those kinds of things are important. Coaches don't like to hear that because they don't want their athletes to get hurt. But it doesn't have to be. You could play multiple sports, I think, and not have it be a true primary recruited sport.
Right. Good. Nancy, how about a couple of others from the audience?
Okay. Yeah, they're coming in now. All right, let's go with, for Dr. Ciccotti, we talked about Dominican players still play baseball year round. Do you see the same types of wear and tear on imaging with prospective players, like the July 2nd signs from the DR compared to their counterparts in the US?
Yep, that's a great question. So Major League Baseball is in the midst of looking closely from an imaging perspective. I think that's what the question is related to, like the kind of imaging changes we would see on MRs. So we're getting studies on these athletes, and we are seeing that these athletes from the Dominican or from outside the United States, they have a high incidence of musculoskeletal abnormalities. I mean, the next question is, is that clinically significant? Because very often those are asymptomatic findings, but they have a high incidence of asymptomatic findings on particularly their shoulder and their elbow MRIs.
Nancy, another question?
From Anthony, do you think there's a correlation between UCL tears, reconstruction surgery in baseball pitchers, and early sport specialization?
Stan, why don't you jump on that one first?
Well, something's doing it because it's not going down. One of the things that we're seeing in UCLs, which kind of goes to this, and I'll make a plug again for the high school athletic trainers who want to get involved in this study, because we do not have the data on high school UCLs. We don't have a clue what's going on other than anecdotal when all these people are coming in at 15 years old with a scar on their elbow. So we're seeing it get younger and younger. What we've seen in UCLs is that surgeries of any kind, the reconstruction or the repairs, we're seeing more repairs for sure. But what we're seeing is that major league players don't have an increase in UCL surgeries. It's the minor league guys that have the increase because they're getting it earlier. Now, what does that cause from? Well, the pros blame the colleges blame the high schools for what happens. They were bad when they got here, sort of thing. But what's happening is everything's getting younger, and here's this big wall called specialization that's staring us in the face, saying, "Why are all these guys having this?" And anybody that's worked with parents, parents are always the same. And I want to get to this whole thing of like, how do you stop? What's your techniques for telling people? Because the parent always comes, and the first thing that comes out of their mouth is telephone or in person. I've done everything right. Before they even tell you what's wrong. I did everything right. I watched his innings. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. I didn't do this. Then you talk to the kid and they did all of that. So the UCLs have to be related to something, and it has to do, for me, you had to pick one thing, and that is increased velocity in order to get to the next level. So, the 15-year-old has to throw 80 to 85 miles an hour to get a college scholarship. The other guy has to, if he's throwing 88 and getting everybody out, he gets no chance to get drafted. Yep.
Can I just add that Brandon Erickson from our group did a very interesting study looking at incidence of UCL reconstruction across the United States in all different age groups over a 6-year period. And through that it was from publicly available information through the Pearl Diver system. And he found that over 50% were in that young 12 to 16-year age group. So 50% of those UCL reconstructions that were done in the United States over that period of time. That's dramatically increasing. And Jimmy Andrews' group with Glenn Fleissig have looked at this over periods of time, looking at this age group. So it's definitely on the rise, and we could debate exactly what it is, but I think I agree with you, Stan. I mean, they feel there's a need for speed, right? I mean, they're so focused on like the velocity and maintaining certain velocities, and they may not be just musculoskeletally prepared to do it at this point in their lives.
Eric, what do you think? There's a question here from Tara in regards to nutritional effects in female athletes, and does that play a role as opposed to men?
Yeah, obviously, when we think about the female athlete, we think about, the female athlete triad and some of those issues that go along with that. I have a colleague at San Diego State, Mitch Rao, who's the head of the physical therapy program there, and he's about to submit a paper. He's presented as an abstract, but he looked at female runners and kind of his research interest is in the female athlete triad. And he did find this connection because, specialization at the end of the day really is about training volume, right? It's about how much are you doing and how much are you, how much overload is there, right? So he found a connection, yes, between, nutritional status, menstrual dysfunction, and sports specialization. So, and sports specialization, though, is tightly linked with training volume. So they're all kind of, when we think about the female athlete triad, there is that interplay there, because if you have a 16-year-old female cross-country athlete who's, has really high mileage and is just doing cross country and no other movement profiles, and it's a very limited repetitive motion, and they're doing it at a high volume year round. You'd expect all those things that you see in that population in terms of bone stress injuries and that.
Marisa, sorry, you're the female on the panel. Do you have anything to add to that, or any experience in that from a nutritional standpoint in female hockey players?
Not firsthand. I haven't, but I mean, who knows, right? So, it might not be something that people want to be open about. But I mean, me, myself, I've always been pretty good at eating, so that was never really an issue.
All right.
I don't know, like the health, healthcare and how to be healthy is something that's, it's something that's of importance in or at least the schools that I went to. So all through, say middle school and high school and stuff, healthy eating was stressed to us, and especially to those who were playing sports and everything. So I didn't see it very often.
Nancy, some more? We got some more, and then I'm going to get down to some brass tacks here on this before we end.
All right. What role does overall strength training outside the sport of interest play? Could elbow injuries in youth be decreased by working on strength and balance rather than more throwing?
Yeah, I'd say, absolutely. I think this is part of the solution, right? Is, we're staring down this. Youth sports, I think, is a $15 or $20 billion industry in the U.S. So there's a lot of these youth club teams aren't going away. So, part of the question as clinicians is how do we, provide guidance and counseling within the system to allow, say, a youth athlete that's only ever played hockey, but they only ever really want to play hockey. That's all they have interest in, and they love it the most. How do we use the recommendations that we have to allow that athlete to, stay safe and reduce the risk of injury? And, strength training, allowing them, you can do a lot within strength training. That's a broad category, right? You can use that to provide, the same kind of stimulation that playing other sports would provide, and provide a movement, a varied movement profile, and do it in an age appropriate way so that they have an opportunity to try out different movements and try out, gain strength and balance in different ways of moving their body, and get that kind of improve their movement quality so that when they go back to their single sport, they are able to do so more safely, and it gives them time off from those repetitive movements that are happening within their sport.
Michael, you want to say something on that? Because
I just agree completely. I think that, like I was saying at the end of my talk, I think we can't drop the mic. Like we can't just say, don't do it, right? We have to say okay, we have to give them an alternative, and it has to have substance to it, right? It has to really be something that we base on research that we know will help them. And whether it's strength and flexibility training and, mobility programs, various types of conditioning that are interesting and fun for them, but also prepare them for their specific sports. I mean, that task is ours to figure that out. But I think we have to deliver an option to them.
now, I'll use the other side of the coin, and just like training in a sport is good, early specialization in a single sport is a much higher risk. Strength training is good and done correctly. The problem is we have the same mentality that these people who want single specialization have with strength training. So it's not unusual for me to see in the gym that we're at a 10-year-old doing squats with a barbell. So the problem is qualified people who know what they're doing based on the age group and what they're trying to do. That's a really complex thing. It's not easy. It's not something you can take from a book and say, okay, do these 3 exercises over and over and over again. And what happens is we have people who, I'm not gonna say not qualified, but not qualified enough to take their age group. And I'm thinking about I'm thinking about your sign on in your presentation, 18 months to 8 years. I mean, we try to tell people that it's all about body weight, and you went up to 12 or 13 or to puberty, and don't start the weights. But again, they're thinking they're going to get the jump on the other guy, and that's a problem. And we're gonna run out of time here, so I'm going to get to this. So I wanted each one to really say, what is the age that you would have your child start a single sport? And let's whether it's a single or individual sport or a team sport. What is the age? Because Feely talked about what is the best age for specialization. And if I read that article correctly, I never got the answer. So is it 14, 15, 16? Is it before 9th grade that you shouldn't do it? How do you put in the factors of different body types and how far they've gone genetically, not genetically, but just on the spectrum, an early, a young 8-year-old versus an old 9-year-old sort of thing. Eric, you want to take that first?
Yeah, I'll go first, and this is probably, going to be a waffly answer, but I think this shows how far we have to go in this research area, because there's no good answers, I don't think. The recommendations are mid to late adolescence, but I think the talks tonight showed how many factors are involved in this, right? Not only the child's, wishes, what the child likes to do, what the child's interests are, but also, what the sport is, what the position within the sport is, what the, are they male? Are they female? All those type of things go into it. And I think we need sport-specific recommendations, and we're a long ways from having sport-specific recommendations. Baseball, I think, is probably the furthest along in terms of, the pitch smart guidelines and those type of things. Yeah. But, you look at girls volleyball and their volume is off the charts, and there's not really recommendations there. USA Hockey has some recommendations. The NBA has some, but the awareness of those recommendations is extremely low when we survey parents. They don't know a lot of these recommendations exist, with the exception of Pitch Smart is, they know of the recommendations, they may not follow them. So that's my politician answer. I don't know if we have a good answer on, what age it would be. I would say mid to late adolescence, based on the research I've seen. 15, 16 would probably be an appropriate age, but it depends on all those other factors.
That's good, Eric, because you said 15 or 16 in one of your papers. So
that's why I have to stand by that now.
If you got to 15 or 16. Marisa, what do you think in regards to ice hockey? Where would you have your son or daughter in the long future that you have? What age would you have them, and what other qualifications would be important for you if someone wanted to do a single sport year round?
I think the, mid to late adolescence is probably the, the best time to do it if you're going to do it. but I would just say that, you know, you need to be educated about it. So, you know, if you are choosing to do, say, one single sport, you know, say outside of school sports, you know, continue to play those school sports, continue to play intramurals, you know, do gym classes where you're playing lots of things. You know, so you might say specialize and focus on a single sport, but continue to be active. You know, in the gym, don't do specific or sport specific movements. You know, if you're a unilateral lateral athlete, if you're in the gym and stuff, try to do other motions, and that sort of thing.
Michael?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with what was said, and this is a very difficult question, but my anecdotal experience, my perspective from the research that we have is that these athletes that are younger, you know, 12, 13, 14, I think they should be playing multiple sports. We could debate how many sports. Is it 2 or 3 sports? You know, maybe that 15, 16, 17-year-old athlete is moving more towards what they would consider a primary sport, but I would still encourage them to play other sports. And maybe it's, you know, later 17 or so, 16, 17, 18, that focusing on a single sport. But then I have to step out of that time frame and say just what Eric and Marisa just said, that we have to consider the musculoskeletal maturity of the athlete. We have to consider the psychosocial maturity of the athlete, their socioeconomic situation, like all those other factors. So we end up being sport specific, but, you know, it ultimately ends up being person specific, like, athlete specific.
This is interesting because we all have this difficulty. I'm sure how many times have you all coached someone to say, listen, you're doing this too fast, and you have, and typically it is the kids who are driven in one direction to do the sport, but it's the parents' influence that really helps a lot. And I have a lot of difficulty giving them more concrete evidence, not evidence, concrete facts about why they shouldn't be doing this at 14. You know, and even looking at the kid, I just had a kid yesterday, his father, he's 15 years old, and his father came to me, we were throwing a bullpen, he's coming back from a Portage defect, and he said, he needs to throw 85 today. I said, well, so should I schedule the surgery today or tomorrow? I said, he can't, 85, you know, has been shown in a 15-year-old to be really bad. And he says, well, he needs to throw 85. So you get in this circular discussion. This is really, really difficult. And it almost feels like we should get training on how to respond to these things that happen to us all the day. Because theoretically, we're the experts. All the athletic trainers and all the strength coaches and all the PTs out there, you're the experts. They're going to come to you for expertise. And when you say, well, it's somewhere between 14 and 15 or 16, well, you shouldn't do it too early, but you can't do it too late. We understand, and these kids go to showcases, which have been shown to be detrimental to baseball players in regards to injury, but, you know, they have to show. The parents say, listen, he has to be seen. And, you know, and so that becomes a problem. Michael?
I would just say, Stan, I agree with you, and it's how you deliver the message, right? Like, you have to be prepared for this. It's going to be, you're going to be in that room for a while when mom and dad are there, and both maternal and paternal grandparents, and, you know, girlfriend, boyfriend, and coaches are there. Like, the more people that are in the room, you know, you're going to be in there for a while. Now, like with the current COVID, you know, that makes it a little bit easier because only one person can come with them if they're under 18, but still there's so much emotion in the room, right? And so we have to figure out how we best deliver the message, like to say, listen, this is the evidence that show that it doesn't enhance performance. This is the evidence that show that it puts your son or daughter at great risk. It's not cost efficient. So we have to provide the evidence, and then we have to say, look, these are people that didn't do it. So, but if they love the sport and they want to play the sport, then we have to figure out how to let them do it and keep them safe, right?
I think it's a great point too. You know, we need to do it better. The club teams are doing a great sales job in terms of the benefits of club sport participation. You know, they're doing a great job of selling this early. You need to be on this team, and the parents are feeling that pressure and the kids are feeling that pressure. You need to get on this team so you can get on that team so you can get on that team. And it's a constant, treadmill. And we're over, the researchers and the clinicians were saying, but it'll increase your risk of overuse injury. And if you're a kid, you know, or a parent, we're not good at assessing risk, right? So you tell a 12-year-old this is going to increase your risk of an elbow injury, and they're going to go, yeah, whatever, you know, I need to be on this team and throw 90 miles per hour or whatever. So, you know, we're not doing a good job of selling the benefits. So I think we do need to find examples of, you know, those exemplars of the people that made it to the highest level, that did multiple things. They were able to be successful without getting, you know, having to buy into that club sports system.
I think that's a really great point, because that's how sports specialization started. The Tiger Wood example, you know, all those kinds of things. And there's been several questions, and I just want to give you my view on this. The Malcolm Gladwell $10,000. You know, he wrote several articles later in different publications saying what he said was an average of 10,000. So there were some people who could do it in 3,000, and someone had to do it in 200 to 20,000. But he tried to push the concept as you can do something for infinity hours. If you have no talent, you have no chance. You still have to, and Jimmy Andrews talks about this all the time. He'll say, a guy came in, he told me he wanted to do this and that, and he wanted a Tommy John surgery. He says, well, hell, you ain't going to be a baseball player anymore. Just pick another sport. But I don't think we can do that. You know, there's a lot of really good questions. I wish we could get to them all, but we're kind of running out of time. And I sure appreciate this is a really good discussion, one that we need more of, and kind of zero in. It's not good just to say, it's because I told you so. That's the worst thing a parent can do. You're right in the corner when you say, because I told you so. You can't play here and doing anything else. We got to keep trying to educate everybody. Listen, I appreciate all the questions from the audience. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, but I don't really want to go too far over our time limit here on stuff and everybody's time thing. Thank you very much. Our next episode will be about a month from now. We're trying to get our EPA, evidence-based approval on this. It's going to be on spine injuries in sports with Dr. Robert Watkins Jr. And Sue Falsoni will be talking on performance and getting back, and another spine surgeon that I'm forgetting.
Dr. Young.
I'm sorry?
Dr. Young.
I'm
Dr.
sorry.
Young.
Yeah, Dr. Chris Young out of Scottsdale. He'll shoot me for that, but that'll be coming to you. It'll be we're shooting for October 14th, as long as we get the CEUs. So we'll be sending you information on that. This program is being recorded and will be online in the next 48 hours at conteperformance.com. You can get that for free, and make sure you please do the survey that's coming up so we can get your CEUs to you as fast as possible. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys, for all, and gals,
Great.
for
Thank
everything.
you.
I appreciate it.
It's great. Great
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're going to leave the program on for a while so you can do the survey. Thanks, Nancy.